France just did something it has not done in years. In the first 3 months of 2026, its economy did not grow, it shrank, and that tiny number is hiding one of the biggest slow-motion crises in Europe. For decades, France was a symbol. Alongside Germany, it was one of the two great pillars holding up the entire European Union. Powerful, rich, untouchable. But that image is starting to crack, and not just for a season. On May 29, 2026, the French Statistics Office released the first quarter numbers. The economy had contracted by 1%. For a country this size, that is not a wobble. That is a warning light flashing red. And here is the part most people miss. France did not stumble from a high point. It had been slowing down for years, quietly, one figure at a time. Watch the numbers fall. In 2023, growth was 1.6%. A year later, 1.1%. By 2025, just under 1%. The engine was already coughing. And the forecasts do not rescue anyone. The OECD expects growth of well under 1% again in 2026 and 2027. No breakthrough, no comeback, just a long, flat line. Now zoom way out to 2008, right before the global financial crisis. Back then, the French economy was worth around $2.9 trillion. By 2026, the IMF puts it near $3.6 trillion, bigger on paper. But the chart tells a darker story. France never got that burst of speed that would let it carry an ever more expensive state. And that is the real heart of this, because France does not run a cheap country. It runs one of the most expensive state models on earth. Sprawling public services, a generous pension system, high social expectations baked in over generations. A machine like that needs an economy that keeps feeding it, and that feeding is getting weaker. France runs on services, consumption, the public sector, tourism, luxury goods, aviation, and a serious defense industry. It is huge and diverse, but it lives and dies on strong demand at home. And in early 2026, 3 engines stalled at the exact same time. That almost never happens together. When it does, you feel it everywhere. Household spending dropped 2%, investment collapsed by 6%, and exports fell 3.5%. Consumers, businesses, and the outside world all pulled back at once. But here is where it gets dangerous, because France is not just slowing down. It is doing it while carrying a mountain of debt approaching 120% of everything it produces. A country like that desperately needs growth, so the debt starts to shrink in the rearview mirror. France has the opposite, weak growth and a debt-smashing record after record. On June 25th, 2026, the numbers landed. French public debt had crossed 3.5 trillion euros, but the scary figure was the ratio. That debt now equals 117.5% of the economy. 1 quarter earlier, it was under 116. In just 3 months, it jumped by more than 75 billion euros. For years, Paris could live with debt like this. The world was different. Interest rates were on the floor. The central bank was gentle. Markets simply assumed France was safe. So politicians did the easiest thing. They pushed the hard choices into tomorrow. But tomorrow has a way of arriving, and you can see it landing in one place first. The bond market. In May 2026, the yield on French 10-year bonds pushed past 3.95%, the highest since 2009. Lenders were suddenly asking a bigger price to trust France. And that has a brutal real-world cost. France's own auditors warned the bill just to service the debt could climb towards 77 billion euros a year. Think about that, 77 billion. Not for schools, not for hospitals, not for the army, just interest. Money that vanishes before it can build anything. This is the trap. High debt, high deficit, and weak growth in the same room. France is not going bankrupt tomorrow. It is something slower and scarier. Every year without reform shrinks the room to move. The walls close in a little more, and the deficit numbers show it clearly. The European Commission expects the French deficit near 5.1% of the economy in 2026, and possibly 5.7% in 2027. The EU limit is 3%. So this is not one bad crisis year. Year after year, France spends far more than it can comfortably fund. Which leads to the real question, how did it even get here? And the answer is not one government or one bad decision. It is how the French state itself has worked for decades. It was built to stay close to its people. Fund the services, pay the benefits, soften inequality, give people a sense of safety even when the economy stalls. A beautiful promise, and an incredibly expensive one. In 2025, French public spending hit 57% of the entire economy, one of the highest levels in all of Europe. More than half of everything run through the state. You see it clearest in pensions. Public pension spending sits around 13 to 14% of the economy, a giant slice, going not to the future but to promises already made. And those promises keep getting heavier. More older people every year, rising costs, and not enough new workers to quietly balance it all out. Macron did push a reform, raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. It helped. But against this much debt and this little growth, it still looks like a drop in the ocean. And this is the cruel bind. To stop the debt, France has to cut. But cutting breaks the very promises it used to win people's trust for decades. And that brings the second problem. Because in France, a reform is rarely just economics. It can become a spark, and France has one of the most explosive protest traditions on the planet. Strikes, blockades, marches, once revolutions. For centuries it has been part of how France works, but now it is a wall in front of every hard decision the country has to make. You saw it in 2018 with the yellow vests. It started over a fuel tax. Within weeks, it exploded into a mass revolt against the cost of living and leaders who felt out of touch. The same fire returned over pensions. On a spreadsheet, working 2 more years is logic. On the street, it sounded like this. The state made a mess, and now it wants you to pay for it. But French streets do not only ignite over budgets. After the death of Nahel in 2023, the country erupted. 45,000 police were deployed against the chaos. Around 2,000 cars burned. More than 200 officers were injured. Over 700 shops, restaurants, and banks were looted or destroyed. Tension that had built for years released in days. And it happens even in celebration. After PSG's historic Champions League win, thousands of police were already braced for trouble. The party still spun out of control. 2 people died. So the real problem is not one protest, or one reform, or one match. It is the pattern. A country where the line between raw emotion and street chaos is razor thin. And under all of it runs another tension: immigration, integration, and the suburbs of the big cities. France has been a country of immigration for decades. Millions of people of immigrant origin work, pay taxes, and are simply part of France. Blaming the whole crisis on immigration would be too easy, but ignoring the strain would be a mistake too. In 2025, France counted around 8 million immigrants, about 11.5% of the population, plus over 6 million foreign nationals. Numbers alone are not a crisis, concentration is. The clearest symbol sits just outside Paris, Seine-Saint-Denis, a few kilometers from one of Europe's richest cities and one of the poorest places in mainland France. Unemployment near 16%, a poverty rate close to 30%, immigrants around a third of residents. The problem is not where people came from. It is poverty, weak schools, and no clear way up. On paper, France promised that everyone becomes simply a citizen of the Republic. In practice, some suburbs became places that are formally French but socially live just beside the country. And that is why this matters. France now has to cut spending, reform, and ask people to sacrifice, in a country where trust between citizens and the state is already running thin. Which leaves the hardest question of all. What can France actually do? In theory, a state like this has 3 roads, and every single one is blocked. Road 1, raise taxes, but France already has some of the heaviest tax burdens anywhere. Push harder, and you risk choking an economy that is already barely growing. Road 2, cut spending. But in France, that spending is pensions, benefits, and services people have leaned on for generations. Touch it, and the streets answer. You just saw how. Road 3, grow out of it. The elegant escape. Grow fast, and the debt shrinks against the economy. But rapid growth is exactly the one thing France does not have right now. So let us be clear, France is not vanishing. It is still the 2nd largest economy in the Eurozone, a nuclear power, a core pillar of the European Union, a giant. But even a giant can buckle if for years it promises more than its economy can carry. France now has to choose, and every choice hurts. The only real question left is which pain it picks first.